So, good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming out this evening. We're here to talk about the lead cleanup effort going on at the House of Providence site. I'm Paul Owens. I'm with the DEQ Remediation Redevelopment Division, and I've got several staff here with me. I've got Steve Hoyne, who's part of the project team for this site, and Terry Gala, who's actually the project manager for the site. And we've got Cheryl Wilson, who is our unit manager that covers the Oakland County area. Also with the DEQ, I've got Mitch Edelman right here. He's my boss from Lansing. And we've got Tracy Kexcometti, who's going to be assisting with the question and answer session. Okay. So basically, real generally, what we do at the DEQ Remediation and Redevelopment Division is that we work with contaminated sites to make sure that contamination is properly mitigated and remediated so that exposure risks are appropriately managed according to state law. Okay. And a couple of things that we don't do is we aren't involved in any permitting. We have no involvement in any licensing processes, for example, foster care licensing or anything like that. So. And as I mentioned, we're here to talk about the lead contamination, and if you have other questions that may be related to like general health concerns related to lead exposure, we do have folks here from Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. I've got Deb McKenzie Taylor here.
Also, we have three other toxicologists with us, Chair, Liz Ginter, and Rosie.
And we've got Tony Dratz from Oakland County. And Tony, do you have anybody with you? Okay, thank you. So we have until 8:30 tonight. And I just wanted to say the purpose of the meeting is this is an informational meeting only, where it's not an official public hearing or public comment. We're not taking public comments. We're not making a decision on any permits or anything like that. So we're here to share information with you and hopefully answer as many questions as we can. What we want to do is we want to spend the first half an hour doing a presentation from the DEQ, and then we'll go into a Q&A. We've already got some questions here in writing, and if you guys have any questions, what we're asking is write them down on an index card or any other kind of piece of paper that you can find, and we're going to give them to Tracy. She's going to be kind of running that show from 7:30 to 8 o'clock. And then at 8 o'clock, we're going to break and we're going to have a one-on-one with, we got enough DEQ staff here, I think, and DHHS staff here as well. So if you guys you didn't get your question answered, we'll be here to answer your questions on a one-on-one basis, okay? So I want to talk real briefly about the lead cleanup criteria or lead cleanup standard. The current standard is 400 parts per million, and that is our residential standard for soil that's protective of direct contact and of ingestion. And about 2 years ago, the DEQ was in the process of modifying our cleanup criteria based on best available science. And at the time, we came up with a number of 190 parts per million based on best available science. So those draft cleanup criteria never got through the legislative process. But when we were meeting with the House of Providence folks, we had recommended that 190 should really be the target because someday it's probably going to be our new cleanup standard. And fortunately, they agreed. They voluntarily said that they would meet the 190. We're calling it a closure target because we can't really call it a criteria because it's not something that we can enforce. But basically, they are going above and beyond what the law requires by meeting the 190. And we also have a cleanup standard for soil that's protective of drinking water at 700 parts per million. And I just want to say to that there have been well over 600 samples collected on the site, and you can see all the dots on that poster right there. Only 6 samples exceeded the 700, so that's a good thing. The goal here will be to remove all of the soils that exceed the 190 closure target level. So that's the end goal. Here's an aerial photo from 1997. It shows the House of Providence site. It's 118 acres, correct? And the site is bounded in red there. You've got East Davison Lake Road to the north and Barber Road on the eastern property boundary. And you've got all these strange patterns on that aerial photo. What that was the technique for creating a good habitat for pheasants. So that's what the former use of the property was. So yeah, I just want to get into the ownership history real quick. So the site operated as a hunt club from 1984 to about 2015. And from 1984 to 2002, they used lead shot throughout the property. They switched to steel shot around 2002 and remained, the facility kept using steel shot until they closed in 2015. I also want to point out that there are 2 main areas where they had what I call focused shooting. And that was the Skeet area, Skeet and Trap area. Steve's going to point to those out. Can you?
No, it's not, we're not seeing my mouse.
Yeah. So the Skeet Trap area was on Parcel 1, and they shot in a southerly direction. Those are those 2 arrows that kind of point to the south. And the shot landed in that kind of that rectangular area and a little bit beyond there. And that's where we really found the highest concentrations of lead. And it makes sense because that's where you saw the most shooting taking place. The other area on Parcel 3 where they had some what I call focused shooting is they call it a European style hunt. That little circle there is where they released pheasants from a tower or a structure, and then they surrounded that with hunters in blinds, and they would shoot the pheasants as they flew out, and the pheasants would fly out in different directions.
And that information comes from?
Yeah, and we verified that. I know Dave Fisher is here tonight. We met with him, and he pointed out these 2 features of the property. The rest of the site was basically used for, I guess we'd call more traditional pheasant hunting, where hunting parties went out with 3 or 4 people and dogs, and they would scare up the pheasants and shoot the pheasants as they flew out. So one point I want to make here is that we do realize that lead shot was used throughout the property, but we're seeing lower concentrations in those areas where you didn't see the more focused shooting, and we're definitely seeing the higher concentrations where you saw the more focused shooting. And I think I'm turning the rest of it over to Steve Hoyne here, right?
All right. I'm going to focus a little more on two things here. Basically, I'll go through the process that that we went through with ECI and House of Providence, and then I'll talk a little more about the technical results. Can't hear me? I'm sorry. ECI is the consultant that House of Providence hired to do the technical work. So what happened was ECI did an initial investigation. This was done prior to any sort of DEQ input. They went out and decided to purchase the property. The House of Providence decided to purchase the property. They would have hired ECI. ECI would have come out and done some investigation, a standard phase 1, phase 2 process, which is relatively standard under property acquisition standards. So they completed an initial investigation, and during that investigation, they identified 4 areas with excess lead, and they ended up in excavating those areas, and I'll talk about that in a little more. And then they also removed an AST during that process. Go on. An above-ground storage tank, sorry. And then ECI, yes, I was told I had to spell out the acronyms.
Yes. At least at the beginning, yeah.
Then ECI submitted an NFA, and I'll explain that, for DEQ review, and that was a no further action report, and that fits in, that's a specific report, that name fits into our regulatory process, and basically what the endpoint, the purpose of a no further action report is what it says, which is when you're done, they should not have to do any more work out at the property. So that's the main function of an NFA. Individuals, of course, and like NFAs, because you get to that point where you're done. So that was submitted to us, and then we reviewed it. And this was where the discussion started about, well, where's the lead? Where'd the lead come from? What's the distribution of the lead? And there were multiple discussions, meetings with us, and we did some of our own calculations and estimations. And in the end of that, we said, well, we think there's more lead out here than the data suggests. And we asked for some further characterization. That's what this, so basically this says that we went through the discussion process, and then ECI and the House of Providence, we suggested that they bring some other staff on board that maybe knew a little bit more about statistics and characterization, and they brought a statistician from MSU on board to assist, and she is very knowledgeable. I don't think, is Sarah here? No, Sarah's not here. She's very knowledgeable with both sampling, how to sample, and how to do statistics, and I'll explain the importance of that in a minute. And they ended up doing some more rigorous sampling plan and something called X-ray fluorescence, which is a very quick way of understanding the distribution of lead, and it assisted in, I'll say, increasing the density of characterization, the number of samples. So ECI and House of Providence then completed that additional characterization, and they proposed NFAs for parcels 2 and 4, and I will talk a little bit more about that. Parcels 2 and 4, they proposed NFAs. And those NFAs were for 400 ppm. Those were not for 190. Those were for 400 ppm. We approved both of those. When I say with modification, we made them move one of the lines down. We had some discussions about exactly what areas were potentially impacted. So basically, the modification was moving one of the property line, or one of the areas down within the Parcel 2, so we kind of shrunk Parcel 2. And then we had ongoing discussions on Parcels 1, 2, and 3, and right now ECI is self-implementing their response action, and that's something that our program allows. And there's Sarah. Hi, Sarah. ECI is self-implementing their response action, which is, again, something our program allows, which is individuals to do the work themselves. And we'll talk some more about that. I'm sure there'll be questions about it. There is ECI is here, yes.
Okay, thank you.
So this is kind of the map that was the first map that was shown to us by ECI, and this map shows yellow and blue. And the blue is our locations. Well, and ECI went out. You can see all the sample locations on this map. ECI went out and did some scattered locations based upon some of their own estimation of the way to investigate this. And they identified areas of scattered lead, and then they identified some areas where they had lead above 400 ppm. And those are in yellow. And those are the areas that they ended up excavating those. They just did it on their own initiative, went out and excavated. This is when they came back into us and they said, okay, we're going to do these NFAs. They had an initial NFA, that this is the initial NFA that they came back to us, where then we said, well, we think there's more lead out here than your data suggests. So we got into this secondary characterization effort, and we requested some additional sampling, and this is where we decided upon a protocol that involved using a statistical approach in addition to using X-ray fluorescence. And the statistics was used to assess whether or not certain areas would likely exceed criteria. So, Parcel 4, over here where there may be, I don't know the number of samples there may be 10, 12 samples there. That was one where they ran a statistical program to see what the likelihood of having hits above 190 or above 400 were. And this gets into the Kriging methodology, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And they also did the same thing for throughout the parcels. And that's where you see those Kriging maps with the colored squares. If you look at some of the data sets, you'll see those colored squares. And those are an effort to assess whether or not what the likelihood is of an area to exceed 190. And the Kriging methodology is relatively conservative. So it's a statistical method that looks at nearby areas and tries to, not only looks at the existing data, but tries to predict what you think the average is of a small area within the larger area. It's a pretty effective method. It's a method that the DEQ has used and is starting to use more frequently because it is conservative in the sense that it tends to go toward the higher end and predict areas that would exceed, that may likely not exceed. So it's conservative in its endpoint. So that was something that we ended up doing. We did this Kriging effort, and as a result of the Kriging effort, Parcels 4 and Parcels 2 fell out of that need for further characterization. Now, we didn't just do that blindly, right? We also were looking at distributions to see and knowledge about what we knew about what the lead shot, what happened historically. We didn't just rely on the statistics to make that assessment. We relied on all the additional, whatever information we had, all of our knowledge. And then what we ended up in this case with at the end point of the Kriging was that Parcel 4 is very low numbers. Parcel 2 has relatively low numbers, though on the north end there appears to be, you can see the two yellow hits kind of on the north end that throw the Kriging off a little bit, and those numbers that area would not necessarily pass the 190. It passes the 400, but it doesn't pass the 190. Whereas Parcel 4 would pass the 190 based upon the Kriging effort. Parcels 1 and 3 did not, obviously. There are significant areas there where there were very high levels of lead. And this map, again, illustrates that. As you can see, this is the X-ray fluorescent data and all the data actually overlaid together. It includes even the earlier samples and again, the X-ray fluorescence data. And when we put this together, we're like, wow, that shows patterns. At least certainly a pattern in Parcel 1, Parcel 3, maybe less so. But once we understood the shooting patterns a little better, we said, oh, that kind of agrees with what our understanding is. So this is the overall sampling results, and we'll talk a little bit more about our expectations because we do have some expectations for additional characterization here. Again, this is just another illustration of Parcel 1 showing the clustering down to the south, and obviously that agrees with the shooting patterns. And you know, which is helpful for us because we tend to want to have a notion, a conceptual site model of what's happening. And when you start seeing agreement with what your concept is, that helps a lot in terms of boosting our confidence in understanding whether or not we've identified the lead at this property. So we were very cognizant of that. This map here shows this is parcel 1 again, and this map actually shows, if you can read those numbers, those are the actual numbers from the X-ray fluorescent. So you'll see numbers, the red ones are the ones that exceed the 190. There's a few, it doesn't differentiate the one that exceed 400, but you can see that there's the ones that exceed the 190 to the south. We've got a couple up to the north that also exceed, and we're not 100% sure where those came from, but remember, we kind of blanketed the area with this X-ray fluorescence, so we've got it pretty well covered. Those boxes represent what we call exposure units, and what the process that we can do for determining whether you have exposure is we can look at these units, and we can estimate an average in there, and when that average exceeds our criteria, then the way it works is that they're obligated to remove the whole exposure unit. So you'll see that there may be hits that are below 190 in some of those areas, but based on our program, the way we've utilized this process, they have to scrape the whole exposure unit if the average within that exposure unit exceeds. So it's a relatively conservative endpoint, and you see as a result of that it almost every point that exceeded is going to be excavated. Now there's a couple of them sneaking around the edges that didn't, and that would have been, if you had the exposure unit, you might have one that exceeds 200 in that exposure unit. When you do the average, then it doesn't necessarily exceed. So sometimes you can have an exposure unit that would have a couple of exceedances. This is Parcel 3, which is a little different. And again, this was a little more complicated distribution. And we ended up with 3 exposure units that exceeded in this area. And you can see in this area, the scattering, it appears that there's more scatter and less concentration. And I think that reflects the shooting activity that occurred there. So we've only got 3 exposure units here that exceed, and we do have some areas, a couple of areas that you have exceedances of 190 that aren't necessarily going to be required to be excavated under this process. What I'll say about that is we're still discussing that. It may be a simple manner of pulling some of those soils in, and that's something that we're still discussing with ECI. So this shows again, Parcel 3, the results of Parcel 3. And I think being a geologist that's done a lot of work, that I see this as one of the better investigations I've seen in terms of at least having data that makes sense, that then agrees with what we think happened out there. And as you can see, looking at some of this data, I mean, there are hits outside. There's 100s and 99s and 121s and 131s, and that's not unexpected to have areas, have some of these samples that would be below 190, but above what I would consider to be a background number. A background might be around 20 or 30 parts per million. So there's some clearly shooting activity throughout this area, but again, our criteria is 190. But very few of the 190s sneak out of our required remediation. And again, I think we're going to talk about that some more with ECI. So I think the summary is that we understand the distribution of lead. There are some areas, and we'll talk some more about that, that's not necessarily perfect. We used averaging to help determine the areas that exceed 190, and I want to just emphasize that using this kriging method and the exposure unit, what tends to happen is we often get folks that'll come in and say, we only want to remove the dots. That happens often. And we have to get into this discussion that we got to have more confidence in that. We can't just have you remove the dots because we don't know whether there's a 200 near that or not. So we use this statistical method actually to be a little more conservative and remove more soils than folks typically want to remove. We get into that discussion frequently. We used averaging, again, to help determine the areas that exceed. And we use this X-ray fluorescence technique because it allowed for rapid and dense data set. And the other thing we did is we wanted to make sure that the X-ray fluorescent data agreed with the laboratory data, because sometimes there's a difference, and we had surprisingly good results here, and I think part of it was the technique. So, you want me to go here, or go ahead? So, House of Province is, our expectation is they're going to submit NFAs for parcels 1 and 3, and they're going to submit final NFAs right after completion of their work. Right, that's usually where the NFA comes in. And I guess we should talk a little bit about self-implementation, but we can talk about it at the end of this slide. House of Providence, to further assess the north end of Parcel 2, this is something that we want them to do. You know, there's those two hits in the bottom of Parcel 2 that I think that it probably, somebody had brought up that there were the shot ranges, and we kind of looked into that a little bit more. Our speculation was that there was maybe some type of shooting that occasionally would exceed the typical birdshot range. So the typical birdshot range looks like it's going to fall within the area that we see, but that's my thinking about those two hits, that they probably represent somebody was out there shooting something that may not have been standard birdshot. And so we're going to have them investigate that further. We're going to go, our expectation is, our ask of them is going to be to go out there and do some additional X-ray fluorescence in this area, and let's see what the distribution of lead is in that area. And then they're going to complete the excavation and scrape of all the exposure units that will exceed 190 ppm. There may be more as a result of this additional characterization. And then the stockpiling of soils, which we already know is ongoing. And the other thing that they have to do is, when they're done with any scrape and excavations, they have to go out and verify that they cleaned it up. You know, the question about whether or not you need to go 6 inches down, 3 inches down, 12 inches down, is really dependent upon how deep that lead either migrated or it's not necessarily the particulates that migrate, but some of the dissolved lead will migrate. So we'll get that information. We don't yet have that information. And then one of the things that we're certainly going to do is do some inspections of these response actions. And we're also talking about some fencing and covers for due care while those stockpiles are in place. And then maybe you want to talk a little bit about Brownfield.
Well, yeah, can you bring up can you bring up the map for that?
Which
that's
one?
on the poster board here.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, I do want to point to Parcel 3 here. This, again, was the area where they had the European-style hunt, and you can see all the blue dots. All of those blue dots are below the 190. There's approximately 300 samples taken on Parcel 3, and we had 20 of those exceeded the 190, and 5 samples exceeded the 400. So we do realize that lead shot was being used out here for years, but spread over a wide area. We're not seeing the screaming hot concentrations when we actually take the soil samples. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. Currently, the House of Providence is applying for a Brownfield Grant to remove all of the contaminated soil and take it to a landfill for proper disposal. That's fairly costly, but that grant process has to go through the Township of Oxford, to get approval, and then it has to go through our DEQ vetting process to get further approval as well. And that money will be used to remove that stockpile of soil and also sample underneath it to make sure that everything was properly removed and remediated. Also, we were planning on using some of that money to do what's called a hydrogeo investigation, so we'll be sampling groundwater. We haven't really talked about that in a whole lot of detail, but the idea would be setting some monitoring wells out and determining the direction of groundwater flow, and then putting another monitoring well down gradient to make sure that we don't have any issues there. So, do you have any questions that were submitted to you? Okay, and I've got, I think we're done.
So we still have, we got a question mark, and,
Thank you.
so I went around and, I thought while they were talking, things might be coming to your mind. I didn't want to disrupt you, but I thought something might be coming in your mind. But there are more question cards. Do you guys have any? I've got a couple of questions that were submitted already, but if anyone has anything that they want to pass forward. Yeah, of course. Anyone else?
Do we have some questions?
You want to go
Give
through
those
the
to
critical
Trey.
ones, or what's this?
So what we normally do
Give those a Trey.
is we collect all the questions, because sometimes you get the same kinds of questions, we can sort of group them together, and then they can talk about the topic in more depth. And so that we try to hear from everyone and we get all the questions and answers. What I've asked is that, let's go through a topic, let them talk about it, and then if you have more questions, you can certainly write them down and pass them in. And then don't forget, these folks will be available for one-on-one if you need more clarification. So what I'd like to ask is that we do this on the cards instead of getting into, hand raising or shouting out. It's just more productive if we can pass it in group types with different types of questions together. And there's cards and pens under that table too. Yeah. So the first couple of questions I have are sort of about DEQ's role and legal authority. So when a property such as this one that's being discussed has no lead contamination, what is your role? What government agencies have a required responsibility to remove residents, especially children, from living on a contaminated site?
The second part of that question is, the DEQ, we don't have authority to remove children from a contaminated site. I don't know if DHHS wants to comment on that or not, or...
So we don't remove the contaminated site, we will offer, some cases that most people will temporary relocation. We've already been able to improve, we've got solvents with groundwater or soil that are coming up into our house. And we would offer the residents temporary relocation while DEQ is working to get mitigation system in the house.
And our role when we have a contaminated site is to make sure that the extent of contamination has been defined and that the risks have been assessed and basically the proper remediation and mitigation is taken so that exposure risks, whether they be direct contact or drinking water exposure, are appropriately managed and or remediated or mitigated.
So a similar question about legal responsibility with Illinois. Does DEQ have any legal responsibility in requiring remediation of alleged contaminated properties such as this, which is children and adults?
So the deal here is the House of Providence purchased the property, is it 2016?
Yeah.
In 2016, they're liable because they didn't do what's called a baseline environmental assessment. That's a report that if you're buying a contaminated property, you submit that report and that gives you some liability protection. So they didn't do that, so they are liable for the contamination. Also, technically the hunt club would be liable since they're the ones that operated there and essentially caused it. And our role is, to make sure that people comply with the law as best as we can. We've got thousands and thousands of sites, so we try to prioritize them as much as we can. So that is our role, to make sure that people are remediating the site in accordance with the law.
So we have a question about our understanding of historical use of the property. What tests back up this understanding that steel shot is used? The regulations only require steel shot for migratory birds and allow lead shot for all other birds.
Well, it's funny you say that, because we actually went on a tour of the site a few weeks ago. Maybe it was early March, a month ago, I guess. And we saw some spent shotgun shells throughout the property, and I picked up a lot of them. All but one of them were steel shot. So there obviously, there was steel shot that was used on the property. There was lead shot too, but that's perhaps a lot of those casings have already been picked up since steel shot was used more recently.
So a related question, are you aware that a calculation was done with the data provided by the former owner, which shows that 7.73 tons of lead shells are in the ground?
No, we weren't aware of that.
And somewhat related to that then too is how much lead shot equals 190 parts per million and 400 parts per million? Can you make any sort of discussion about how much lead is that?
Yeah, spread out. Yeah, I really can't. We'd have to do some quick math up here. It's over 118 acres of property. I imagine 118 acres of property could probably hold quite a bit of lead and still fall below the 190. Obviously, that's what we're seeing on our results.
I think that's a good question. I've actually thought about that. Not that I've calculated it, but I think it's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that. Maybe you folks have an idea. Do you have any idea how much lead shot pellets would have made up one of your samples? No idea? No? Go on.
I believe that you have this whole calculation
And what's your estimate?
lead shot in the ground with how many shells and how many
Right.
keys and all that. I believe you have this data.
Yeah, we did just receive.
But I think the key to that is remember, the sampling protocol that's used to assess the exposure risk is a soil sample, and the EPA requires a soil sample of a certain size, and the lab requires a soil sample of a certain size. So the risk is based upon a soil sample, and that soil sample may have lead in it. That could have a lead shot in it. It could have particulates from that lead shot, or could have stuff that dissolved off of that. And so it could have that whole spectrum. Now, this discussion there's been a discussion about bioavailability and the bioavailability of lead shot versus, and that's not something that we've necessarily entertained. I mean, our numbers, our 190 numbers are relatively conservative numbers, and right now we're comfortable with those numbers. But we have had some discussions about the idea of what exactly the effect of a single shot would be or could be.
So Steve, maybe,
Hold on.
I actually just wanted to ask a question about the data that were used to estimate the volume of the soil that would contain lead. I think it's important to look at where those data were collected, because we clearly have, by kind of peppering the site with the XRF samples, we have a pretty good idea of where that is. So I'm wondering if the estimates of that the club has corresponds to those same areas that the measure collected.
That would be an interesting sort of check of whether or not, I mean, I think, right, because what you're saying, Sarah, is that we could use this data to estimate a lead volume. We could estimate a lead volume using this to see how those compare. That'd be a worthwhile calculation.
We also need to take a look at how those estimates are made, because they could be made assuming a 14, they could be so you would have to.
Yeah. It's something that I'm curious about, and I think we'll take back and look at.
So, to that point, you talk about the depth of remediation, you talk about the areas that are just scraped. At what depth will those exposure units be scraped?
My understanding is it's only going down a couple of inches, right?
Yeah, a couple of.
Yeah, the strategy is to scrape off 2 or 3 inches, then sample. And if the samples show you're okay, you stop. If the samples show that you're not okay, keep scraping until you get clean soils.
So what depth do the samples that you already have represent? Are those right at the surface?
Those are
Is that-
basically 0 to 2 inches.
Yeah.
Well, some of the earlier ones were the soil
So-
borings.
After you scrape and you resample, you get to the point where it's clean. If the land is disturbed, the soil moves in the future, for normal activity on the property, right? So build a shed, a garage, utility garden, something like that. Put in a septic or driveway, and the lead risk increase.
In an area where we've,
Where it's already been scraped, or
Oh.
an area where you've decided no further actions.
yeah,
Once the property gets to the point where you think everything meets the 190,
yeah.
10 years down the road, if they dig a pond, if they put in a septic, could you increase that risk?
No, the conclusion is that we reach a no further action, and it's basically an unrestricted use at that point.
But I mean, the question about whether or not there's GSI risk or other risks, right now we're doing an NFA for direct contact.
For direct contact,
You gotta keep that in mind.
So what I heard,
We're evaluating the,
the beginning though, was that if go back to the slide that had the lead criteria on it. So if they do a no further action, if they obtain the no further action report for the called direct contact, that number's 190.
right.
right?
And that's also protective of possibly having a drinking water well, sorry, it's that number 700.
Right.
About the 2 soils, groundwater, outlets.
Right. As we said earlier, the question about whether or not that we have a groundwater risk is something that we're going to further characterize. I think that the likelihood of a groundwater risk is relatively small because of the duration of shot, how long this was operated, and we'll see with the verification data how deep this lead went. If this lead didn't migrate very deep vertically, then the likelihood of it migrating deeper and entering an aquifer becomes less and less. It's something we're going to evaluate. I think our expectation, though, is in addition to that, we're going to do some groundwater characterization assuming we can get some grant funding. So we're looking at that pathway. Again, right now, the NFAs are focusing on the direct contact exposure pathway to allow for the operation that they're planning. That's a discussion we're going to have with them. We've talked, we're going to find out where those soils are and talk about that. We're going to look at there are some areas near the house that definitely need further action. And that's something that.
Were they scraped before they started?
Well, if the areas that exist that haven't been scraped as a result of the construction on the north end of Parcel 2 is something that we're going to characterize and understand now. You make a good point, though. The areas that they already did work on, we'll have to have a discussion about where those soils are, where those soils are come from. Depending on what we find out with the characterization, too.
Sarah's got a comment.
Steve, you talked about future actions and the soils are being stockpiled, and the possibility for the soils to be removed if there's a Brownfield Grant. What's the other alternative if we don't have the Brownfield Grant, and how long is the stockpile allowed?
Do you
So, the plan is to remove the soils with a Brownfield Grant and store those soils temporarily. The Brownfield Grant is going to take anywhere from 4 to 6 months. The soils would be stored on site. They would be covered with a layer of clean soil and vegetated, and then there would be a fence going around there to prevent anybody from accessing it. If they're not able to secure the funding to actually remove the soils, then the law does allow them to have those soils remain on site. And in this case, they would cover it with 2 feet of clean soil, vegetate it, and then install a fence around it. That would require also a operation and maintenance plan to go out and inspect it forever, and also to get a legally enforceable agreement, what we call a post-closure agreement with the state of Michigan, that they are going to take on these obligations in perpetuity. We would also expect some groundwater monitoring if that were to happen too. If there's long-term storage of soils, we would expect some groundwater monitoring to make sure that there's no leaching down into the groundwater.
Maybe there's some questions up here too.
Yeah, we do have questions up here.
Yes, well, I know that you had sent out an email to, I think the group of folks that you had contact information for and asked for some questions to be submitted up front. We have a whole packet of a couple dozen questions that are fairly detailed and refer to
That's this-
exhibits and such.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts on how in this setting we could respond to that productively. I was trying to go through what I thought were the quicker
Let me
questions
see.
first, and then with respect to the time that you put into filing that. Did you guys have a chance to review that? I don't know when to submit it.
No, just, in bits and pieces right now. So they are pretty detailed questions. We would like to get to them, but I don't know if we could get to them right now.
Mitch is looking through them right now, and we'll
Okay.
maybe try to assess what would be appropriate to answer in this setting that would be useful for discussion without going into a lot of exhibits and such, right? That, for sort of the understanding of everyone, and I'll go through a couple of these quick questions while he does that.
Well, the first,
Okay.
I think it was already been covered, questions along the lines of, was this work approved by DEQ prior to it being done? If so, when? If it wasn't pre-approved, it covered the fact that, House of Providence did some investigation work, did some excavation. There's a question here about, reports of dump trucks. I suspect those reports are related to materials that were hauled off during the voluntary actions that House of Providence undertook before. So that first group has likely been covered, generally by the presentation. And I'll continue looking at principles.
So this is in reference to the number of samples here in this map. So there was really extensive testing on parcels 1 and 3, and I think they did a good job talking about what the land use was there and why that supports more sampling. There were only 14 samples on parcel 2, and that's where the house is going to be. So can you talk about whether or not there will be more sampling there, or sort of how that jives in your mind with what the land use is going to be and the number of samples, if it's appropriate number of samples?
Sure. Just to reiterate, when we looked at that Parcel 2 data set, and they did the statistics on that, that passed the 400. Those 2 samples weren't necessarily very hot, but they were hot enough to have the exposure units be above 200 but less than 400. So we had areas in that northern area of Parcel 2 that we knew exceeded the 190, but yet met the 400. And if you remember, the original NFAs were for 400. So this is a discussion we've been having with them, and the House of Providence understands that we need to look at that a little more closely and ensure that the levels in that north area are below 190. So we're working towards that with them right now.
So, well, I have a question here, I think is good for you to address, and back to your criteria slide, maybe. It's a bit of a statement and a question, but sort of expressing the desire that the property should be 100% remediated, no lead left on it. People are living there, there should be no lead on the property for health, for habitat, for future land use and water quality. Have you considered 100% remediation? And if you get the brownfield dollars, will it be 100%?
No. Yeah, first of all, we have no authority to require complete removal of lead. Actually, I think a lot of you probably know that lead is naturally occurring in soils. It's everywhere. I mean, you can go outside and sample the soil right out here, and you're going to find lead. So the criteria are set up as risk-based criteria that are protective of exposure. So, and that's what the law requires. And even a brownfield grant, we would never get approval to remediate the whole site down to background levels, because that would just be way too expensive, probably in the tens of millions of dollars to do that.
I mean, what I'll say, sorry, Paul, is that, you know, when we often get this request on unrelated sites for brownfield monies. There's a lot of individuals that will come to us and say, we really want to clean this up to something more rigorous, and we typically can't, under our program, spend that money to clean up beyond our criteria.
So you talked a little bit about future groundwater investigation. So there's a question about an artesian well on the property, and the several neighbors contiguous and within the half mile also have artesian wells on their property. And is there a risk of dispersion there with the lead to be contaminated groundwater systems?
Yeah, if there, well, the artesian wells, it's interesting. I'd like to see the well logs on those and see how deep those are. It may very well be that there's a clay layer that probably prevents that's acting as the artesian aquitard. So we'll have to look at that specific geology of those wells, and that's something that we'll certainly will talk about when we start talking about the investigation for the groundwater that we're going to ask for. I'm really interested in that information, though, too, on those artesian wells. I don't know that we have that. Do we have that?
I think so.
No.
So for the folks that have that concern, make sure you find Skeet after this part. Could you bring up the aerial and show us where the stockpile will be, or where it is now, and what soil will be stockpiled?
You mean,
Oh,
And that's
you know, I
related
wish.
to one of the questions on here.
Oh, you can stand there.
Recorded, stored on site in fenced area, either
okay,
permanently or
there,
It's right
temporarily, while the waste go to the landfill.
it's just
So
the yellow area.
questions related to that.
On the poster. It's in the yellow
Is there a
area.
concern about runoff associated with stockpiling the soil? Talk about how it'll be marketed and fenced. How long will it be before it's sent to a landfill to that time frame?
So yeah, these are the areas that are being scraped off here, and there's another square up here, there's a few squares in here, and all of that is currently being stockpiled kind of right along this area here. So it's basically like a big berm that they've formed in that area. And they still they've done the scraping, but they haven't done their verification samples, and that's the next step, to do their verification samples of the areas that have been scraped. So there could be more soil that are stockpiled here. We are concerned about runoff, and that's why we want to make sure that the stockpile soil is covered with a clean cover, and also that it's a vegetative cover that wasn't flooded.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's pretty far away from the pond, and there'll be fencing around it as well. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I believe the area that, if it ends up being stockpiled, would be somewhere in that contaminated area that's got the red dots and yellow dots.
This
Because
area.
the idea was that it wouldn't be moved to an area that previously met.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to show that. I got a little, yeah.
So what Sarah's saying is that under our regulations, that that the stockpile has to be placed in an area that's already contaminated. You can't take the contaminated soils and move them to a clean area.
So there's a concern about the truck traffic that folks are hearing, and the possibility that soil or other materials are being brought in instead of taken out. And is there any possibility that we're just bringing soil in and covering or capping the area at this time?
Terry, do you know anything about that?
I'm sorry, I was reading this. Can you repeat that?
Yes, we don't know about soils being brought into the site.
Yeah, I wasn't,
Concern that the observations of the trucks is that soil is being brought in and that possibly contaminated areas are being pumped out.
I'm not, I wasn't, I'm not aware of any soils being brought in.
Yeah, we're aware that there's stockpiling going on.
And that's pretty cool.
Any proposed soil being brought in. Nancy, you want to talk about that?
I have nothing like that. No solar, and we're willing to cover the
So admitted, some of this packet may require more in-depth review, and just a lengthen it, a number of questions. So Paul, is there some way that if we don't get to all of this tonight, we can get answers back to these folks on some of the more in-depth questions?
Yeah, we'll have to go through the packet and along with your exhibits and.
Hey, Paul, can I ask you a question? You said that stockpile is pretty far from the counter, but topography is like downhill where where all that lettuce is at right now. Is it downhill to where that big pond is at? And, you know, there's a little boat there, so obviously somebody likes to go and do something like a little pond, or somebody wants to go fishing and stockpile it with fish, or kids swimming in it. Would you have to put a big fence around that pond and say, you know, the full of water?
Well, probably the best thing that you could do there is just put like a silk fence around the stockpile to keep soil runoff.
Is there a silt fence in there right now?
There's not, first of all, it's all downhill, actual stockpile, everything's going downhill, so nobody thinks going downhill, anything can go uphill, so, yeah,
But I mean, we should have a silt fence around that.
that's right.
We haven't collected it, but we can put a system. We haven't done any scrapings to prove it. They are all the work to retain it until
What did you say again? You didn't do the scraping to, I didn't understand that. Now, the pile consists of what material?
It's the soil that we're gonna scrape from the 11 exposure
Mm-hmm.
will be in the unfilled.
Uh-huh.
At the southern portion of Parcel One. And it's about a football field from the pond.
And the existing pile is what material?
Soil
From where?
from Parcels 3 and 1.
So you have a pile right now that has parcel,
Right.
No, we will, once we scrape, we haven't done the scraping. We started to in October, you recall, we had a lot of water, so we couldn't do our XRF plans.
I see, so you've got a partial scrape,
Right.
partial scrape in
Yes,
some areas.
yes.
So those piles are from a partial scrape, correct? Of area from parcel 1, I presume, right?
So, I think what I'm hearing is someone who's not familiar with the site that these guys are. So, there's already a small pile, stockpile. There will be more soil scraped. Paul talked about, you know, long-term clean, if the pile has to stay there, clean soil and vegetation. But it sounds like in the short term, a silt fence should be put around that pile, which is physically standing, just traps the soil physically moving down that pile, right? So,
Yeah.
that sounds like a reasonable short-term thing to do around even the existing pile that's there.
Yes.
Right.
So I have another question about, some of the historic land use. There was lead shot used for dog training, from the fifties until Dave purchased the property. Has that been addressed, and is that understood about the property?
Yeah, that was, somebody brought that up to me tonight, and I think there was some mention in it, in one of the old Phase 1 reports. I think it said 1973, dog training took place from 73 to about 84, and in that process, they did, part of the process of training dogs, I guess, was for pheasant hunting, and so they would basically go through the process of scaring up the pheasants and shooting them down, so, yeah. That's, again, that's, we're basically going with what the data is showing. The data is showing that the areas that we saw, that we know of where the more concentrated shooting took place is where you have the concentrations that exceed our criteria or our target numbers.
Well, this question is similar, so I think what you're addressing is, some trap shooting that was done in the northwest area of the property, and the sort of unique pattern that you had there, and it appears that this wasn't addressed. So I think you talked about that earlier, that there is lead all over the property, right? And there was certainly shooting in all of the areas, right? The more concentrated patterns that we're seeing.
Yeah, that's what you're seeing in the area on Parcel 1, the southern area, Parcel 1, with all of the yellow and red dots. That's basically where the shot was landing from the Skeet field.
But I think we would welcome that information. In other words, if you know areas that were shot, particularly like, for example, Parcel 4, you knew that there was activity, I think that's helpful for us if we don't have that. And we can then look and see if there might be areas that we have to make sure that the areas that we are saying are okay are okay. So if there was shot activity that was happening that we don't know about, it's helpful to have that information, so.
So what I'm hearing from the panel is that the site characterization isn't necessarily done, right? There will still be more sampling, more information comes out, there will still be more sampling on it. So this is not every sample that will be taken.
Right. Our focus is going to be on the north edge of Parcel 2, but we're going to be out there looking, and now's the time if we want to look further at if there's other areas that may require investigation. So I think it's sort of up to ECI and us, of course, to look into where this shot activity occurred, and let's make sure that we investigated those
Sarah's got
areas.
a question. Sarah?
Know what the boundary of the hunt club is relative to the boundary shown on the cluster? The hunt club extends further than the wall.
I wanted to say that before, the hunt club was 138 acres and extended north above the boundary that you see. House of Providence purchased only 118 acres. We ditched the 20 acres when my company did investigations in 2004. We found a lot, we were doing it for a bank, and the hunt club was still active. We found a lot of land north of the House of Providence property. And that may be, and I understand, one of the owners provided an affidavit that stated that someone trained pistol shooting on that northern property and shot lead into an event. So keep in mind, you're only looking at the 118 acres, which is the House of Providence property.
I have a question.
We did a test first in 2004, we did a test in 2017, 2018, and we'll be testing in the working on period in 2019.
So I just asked, for follow-up questions, you guys were in the one-on-one, we only had this space until 8:30. So we were going to do this part until 8, but I still have a number of questions here, so why don't we push this to maybe 8:15, and then, both DEQ and our health staff will be available for any more follow-up questions. Deb, do you want to address some of the health-related questions now that we went through
So there were some questions related to the 190 million level flow, and that representing the 5% of the So to let you know, CDC previously had set, some of these people had set an acceptable level of 10 and 400 parts per million is based on that 10 parts per micrograms per deciliter blood level. And they lowered it, it was about 5 or 7 years ago, to 5 micrograms per deciliter. The 190 is based on that low of 5 micrograms per deciliter, what CDC recommends, that you make sure that children's blood is less than 5. That's what that's based on. Yes, there is statements that we have not found a safe level of blood because of studies that have been conducted that show even at 2, 3 micrograms per deciliter, and we're getting better ability to measure as time goes on. Typically, we see about a 1 microgram per deciliter blood level is the limit of detection. As we don't know when we see lower levels that CDC will start lowering that, but right now the CDC recommendation is 5 micrograms per deciliter, and that's what the recommendation is based on. The other thing to know about the 190 is it's not just assuming that you're exposed to level 4. It's looking at exposure to multiple pathways of exposure. That considers water, drinking water exposure. It considers inhalation, air exposure, so that it's not just looking at water exposure.
I guess what I want to point out is, based on our response action here, that if you really examine some of the numbers outside of the areas, most of these are pretty low. So when we're done with this, the exposure is going to be well below 190, certainly on Parcel 1, and that, as a result of the nature of getting the exposure units and of the averaging technique.
So, I just wanna make sure that the question, I try to think of things that other, about questions people might have. Can you talk a little bit about that exposure, and how the 190 is related to the blood level? And we're talking about acute, and the kid goes out and digs in the dirt right now at that level, or?
This is exposure over time. So one of the things that go into estimating how much you get soil is how much people get into that soil, incidental investment. And there's actually been some studies of young kids, all of our number of people who studied of young kids, where what they did was they had trace. They measured the trace elements in soil where the kids played, and then they measured the levels in the food that they were eating, and then they measured the levels that were clean out in their diapers, and then they subtracted the levels from their food, determined how much soil they had ingested. So, the bragging speak that has to because they were saying and measure that those trace element levels in their diapers. So, but that's what the data comes from, to figure out what soil ingestion rates are, and assuming whether that are the most vulnerable. So those are some of the things that go into these, determining what these criteria are, is those kind of inputs in leverage levels, what kind of soil there are. So there's some case, it's supposed to be an UK model, but it's a case 400. At this point in time, you will see that to 5 the blood lab, and that results in a 190 value. They are still working on that. There is something called an all cases or an adult blood model, and that is kind of a very limited exposure, and it results in higher well, that is soil concentration as well. Most vulnerable populations is the
There were several questions in the packet related to something that's called due care in the Part 201, and for those of people that aren't familiar, people who own or operate contaminated properties and have knowledge of that they're operating contaminated properties have obligations to protect people from that contamination. Several of the questions may believe that the due care obligations extend to protecting people and the environment. So one thing I can say is the section 201(7)(a) that's cited in numerous questions that are in the packet. An important point with respect to due care is that it's meant to protect people, and so then several of the questions arose. Have we, the department, assessed the current owner's compliance with their due care obligations? And I don't know whether we've formally assessed that. I know from the questions that were posed to us that the questioners noted from correspondence that the department has issued that we did bring it to the owner's attention that they've got so-called due care obligations, and I don't know whether we formally assessed their compliance with it. And there were other questions about, okay, so if people knowingly move contaminated soils and it causes the runoff problems, is that considered being in compliance with due care or not? I would say probably not if they move contaminated soil and it caused if it caused risk to human health, that would be potentially a violation of due care. But I don't know whether the team from Southeast has anything to add about where we've gone so far on due care.
Yeah, the only thing I want to add too is the main component of due care is to mitigate unacceptable exposures. And that's what they're in the process of doing right now. So by the sampling, they know where their hot areas are. They're scraping those soils. They will be preventing access to those areas, and hopefully within a matter of a few months, removing all of those soils.
So Paul, once they have scraped all the contaminated areas, nothing but the stockpile, the areas that were scraped, do they have due care obligations in those areas, once it's down below those 190?
No.
So when you think about those questions about, well, what if they put, what if they till the land, or what if they put in a septic tank, or they have no due care obligations?
Correct.
Once they get the NFA approved?
Yeah, correct. Due care obligations, I mean, there's the legal statutory language that apply to what's called a facility. If you remove the soils to meet the generic residential criteria, which is what the plan is to do, then it's no longer a facility and you no longer have due care obligations.
What if they get cow and chickens or they do care?
Yeah, our law does not cover livestock. So what I tell people when they ask that question is contact Department of Agriculture and Urban Development for some guidance on that. There's all kinds of guidance that they can give you.
So, we only have the space until 8:30, and we have a number of questions here, and I think there were some other things, maybe coming out of the packet. So, Paul and his group are gonna think about a way to go through this and communicate answers to the things we didn't get to. So I've set aside the ones we did get to and the ones we didn't, but we still have the space for 15 minutes, so why don't we break now and give you guys the opportunity to talk to these folks one-on-one. So,
Look at his question.
that's this question?
Yeah.
I just got?
Yeah, what is question?
Okay.
Sorry.
Why is this person giving any response? He is not part of DEQ, he's on the payroll. I think we're talking about ECI as a consultant, or ECI as a consultant. Why is Lance being allowed to speak? I think is the question.
I see.
Why is the
Okay.
consultant speaking?
Well, we asked him a specific question that we didn't know the answer to, so we called on Lance. So, yeah.
So why don't we break now? Folks, we've got our health team here, the DEQ folks,